It was the year of 1860, when American values were set aside. Becoming one of the most important of our nation, it represented a time of bravery, strength, leadership, and death. The world was changing, and the United States was no exception. Would the values of equality, found within the revered Constitution, be upheld? Or would a minority be able to undermine the entire unity that had been around since the beginning?
November 6th, 1860. This was the day to go down in infamy. A greatly divided nation is split along a strict border, and tensions have risen to the point of no return. Abraham Lincoln, a humble Republican from the state of Illinois, is elected president. Chaos ensues. Just 1 month later comes this detrimental ordinance. We, the people of South Carolina, have solemnly declared that the union existing between this state and the other states of North America is dissolved, and that the state of South Carolina has resumed her position among the states of the world as a separate and independent state.
Two opposite yet so similar forces begin their battle at once. The northern states formed the Union Army, and the southern formed the Confederacy. Americans on both sides expected the war to be over in a matter of months. The North was consistently better in almost every category, ranging from having double the South's soldiers, more firepower, a larger population, and even morale, as the North was fighting to keep the Union alive. But when in April of 1861, the South Carolinian Fort Sumter was put under rebel fire, then President of the Union, Lincoln, called upon its citizens to volunteer and make the ultimate sacrifice. The Davis Guards of Acton, Massachusetts, responded immediately, consisting of boys from not only Acton, but of Stowe and other surrounding towns as well. They joined the 6th Regiment in Baltimore on April 19, 1861, coincidentally on the same day as the Battle of Lexington. The regiment proceeded to Washington and resided in the Senate chamber. Colonel Jones later recalls meeting President Lincoln, who, with tears in his eyes, gratefully thanked the regiment for their quick call to action and their preparation. He told them that they saved the Union. On the early Eastern Theater, the Union was faring badly against the rebels. With a loss at the First Battle of Bull Run and a retreat in the Peninsula Campaign, the North exposed its incompetent generals. Additionally, nations around the world looked ever more likely to join the fight on the side of the Confederates, due to economic ties which could have tipped the balance enough to secure a rebel victory. Northern General George B. McClellan, or Little Mac, was idolized by those who fought alongside him, but he had a tremendous fear for risk. During the first months under his leadership, the Union Army remained on the defensive, just outside of Washington. Lincoln was getting frustrated. He was eventually forced to order McClellan to take the offensive. In an event that shocked the world, the South, led by the infamous General Lee, won victory after victory, leaving the North with confusion and depressed spirits. Towns across the Union did everything they could to give their nation the best chance at victory. Stowe was no exception. Immediately, the selectmen met and appropriated a sum of $1,000, which would serve to clothe and supply their volunteers, as well as help the families of those who traveled to the battlefield. Stowe's soldiers, by the end of the war, had entered into 25 regiments and totaled 112, including 3 men from Boston and 3 colored men. However, not only the town's men provided their nation with a push, Stowe's women were called into service as well. While not on the front lines, women became nurses, furnishers, sewers, and encouragers of volunteering. The northern economy at the time was one of relative modernity. Its impressive infrastructure, which included railroads, canals, and steamboats, connected towns to farms and the overall nation together. The North took advantage of the Industrial Revolution when its cities began to bring factories to prominence. These factories could make goods from raw materials much faster than simple handmade ones from artisans. Mills also became ubiquitous. The northern economy, in reality, emerged even more prosperous as a result of the war. In Stowe, the Rock Bottom Cotton and Woolen Company demonstrated the economic success of the North. Throughout the 19th century, it prospered, and during the Civil War, it did even better. The company supplied much of the clothing and blankets for the armies, manufacturing it from cloth. Additionally, the Assabet Valley was home to an even larger textile industry. The mills there also supplied the Union with clothes. Back in the war, the Western Front provided the Union with what the Eastern Front lacked: hope. General and future President Ulysses S. Grant was exceptionally genius and instantly became an amazing asset for the North. The Eastern Theater was plagued with mountainous terrain, which allowed the outnumbered South to deal devastating blows to the North. But the West was not. Flat, long plains, as well as the stretched thin Confederates, allowed the Union to move farther and farther south along the Mississippi River from Missouri and Kentucky. The West was covered in large farms and plantations. These farmers made large profits, but they rapidly exhausted the soil. Additionally, Eastern farmers during the war were forced to make a tough decision. With new railroads in the Erie Canal of New York, being able to easily and cheaply transport supplies from the fertile West, they were forced to either move and work more fertile land than the rocky New England soil, or they had to work in the city and get a factory job. Conditions were tough, with many being forced to live in workers' housing, right outside the factory. Workers were also forced to do hard labor in unsafe factories for long hours. Despite the harsh work environment, these laborers were grateful for their jobs and for their ability to earn money for their families. The Civil War was not so easy on the South, who had initially estimated they would be able to secure their economy. Having plummeted by the end of the war, the Confederates exposed major flaws in the individualistic beliefs they had been formed from. Because the South believed in states' rights, and a central government with less power, they could not collect federal taxes as a large part of their income. And in the 5 years it existed, their currency became inflated 9,000% compared to the North's 80. Additionally, the South severely overestimated the importance of their cotton to economies around the world. Nor did the West rely on the South as much as they had believed. Railroads and steamboats, the major players of the Industrial Revolution, allowed the West to ship their materials to northern factories, cities, and ports, instead of southern ones. Even though in 1860, the majority of Europe's economy relied on southern raw cotton, European citizens found themselves extremely opposed to joining the rebels. So while the Confederates believed that the Union blockade, which had prevented southern trade, could drag Europe into the war, the idea of fighting for slavery was too much. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin was sensational. Hit hard by the disturbing stories of southern slaves found within, millions of Europeans would refuse to fight. The war was then in the hands of just the North and the South. Back on the East was the Southern push beginning at the Second Battle of Bull Run. After his disappointing failure in the Peninsula Campaign, Union General McClellan was replaced by John Pope. This change in leadership may have handed victory to the Confederates, who now began to push farther into Northern Territory. Lincoln was faced with one of many tough decisions. Would he submit to growing public pressure and reinstate the beloved General McClellan? The Civil War easily became the bloodiest in American history. In the end, around 625,000 soldiers died during the war, with 210,000 dying in action, and 30% of all white Southerners losing their lives. During the Second Battle of Bull Run, a Southern victory, some wounded men on the battlefield were left for 3 days.
Lincoln gave in to public outcry, and the Union won at the monumental Battle of Antietam, not only raising morale, but halting the Southern offensive, pushing them below the Mason-Dixon line, and permitting Lincoln to finally do what he had wanted to do for so long. Up to that point, the North was fighting for the survival of the Union, with no intention of freeing the Southern slaves. But their victory at Antietam gave the radical abolitionists of the Union what they had been fighting so valiantly for: the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln wanted to wait until the Union was winning, as to make sure not to upset the border states, which were somewhat reliant on slaves, and were mainly part of the Union to protect unity, and not to give black rights. When Lincoln did issue his proclamation, slaves began to flock to the Union Army. Tens of thousands of Southern slaves moved north to army camps, confirming the horrifying abuse which they endured. This was the final moral push for the Union. They were fighting now not only for the continuity of a less than century-old United States, but also for the abolition of almost 4 million slaves. One of the first black regiments to form during the Civil War was the Massachusetts 54th. Commemorated in a monument across the street from the Massachusetts State House, this group of brave men was the result of persuasive recruitment from leaders like President Lincoln and civil rights activist Frederick Douglass, and even from places like Canada and the Caribbean.
With McClellan's risk-fearing attitude again plaguing the Union Army, General A.E. Burnside was put in as his replacement. He decided to attack Lee at Fredericksburg, but his attempt proved to be impossible. Tens of thousands of Union soldiers died in what is now known as Burnside's slaughter pen. As a result, Joseph Hooker became the next Union general. But, due to a plan brilliantly executed by Lee, he lost at Chancellorsville in Virginia. During this battle, Confederate General Stonewall Jackson was killed not by a Union-fired bullet, but by a Southern one. A very costly accident strips the South of one of their greatest generals. Again, the Union general is fired, this time replaced by George Meade, who becomes the leader when the Confederates make their last-ditch attempt at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. The Union was able to protect their capital from exposure and win this essential battle, even with the many soldiers who died as a result. Gettysburg ended the final time where Confederates crossed the Mason-Dixon line. When President Lincoln arrived at the cemetery there, he recited one of the greatest speeches in the history of the world. Meanwhile, Grant continued to push the rebels in the West. Their most important victory was the siege of Vicksburg in Mississippi, which resulted in the South being split in half. This meant that it would be near impossible for Southern supplies to traverse the Mississippi River. Women were an essential aspect of the Union's campaign. Dubbed the Women of the Loyal States, these soldiers did not fight on the front lines, but they made it possible. Women from around the country, including towns like Stowe, were called upon to fight half the battle by furnishing many different articles of clothing. Additionally, they helped heal wounded soldiers. Clara Barton was one of the most infamous nurses at the time, and she went on to create the American Red Cross. Stowe's women had a difficult job, but they were certainly up to the task. Blankets, socks, shirts, food, magazines, pillows, yarn, and even more were all gathered by women to help the soldiers during the Civil War. Grant was an amazing general. Not only did he succeed in dividing the Confederacy, he went on to conquer Tennessee after the fall of Chattanooga. With this, the Deep South Confederate state of Georgia was ready to be taken. Grant assigned this task to General William Tecumseh Sherman, who was able to capture Atlanta in September of 1864. He then burned the city. Sherman, from Atlanta, paved a path of destruction to the Atlantic on what is now known as Sherman's March. During this movement of troops, Confederate civilians expressed their hatred for the Blue Bellies, a nickname for Union soldiers, as their uniforms were blue, while the Confederates were gray. The Union soldiers destroyed homes, railroad junctions, supplies, and everything else in their path. Most important, however, was their ability to destroy morale, which they accomplished by fighting the war in civilians' homes. In January of 1865, their march ended with the fall of Savannah. They then traveled to North Carolina. The Civil War proved harmful to the average Confederate town. With their most able men sent away, the towns had to think in prayers. Winning at first, towns were filled with glory and pride. But as the war progressed, it looked more and more so that the Union would win. In an effort to combat this, Southerners melted window weights in the bullets, made gourds out of dishes, and supplied any pins they could possibly find. Because the South had a rapidly shrinking economy, they had little money. So, Southern girls, as they were called, were so invested in the idea of their new nation that they were even willing to sell hair abroad. Although, this plan could not work with the Union blockade in place. The North was the opposite, however, with their economy booming. Combined was a larger population than the South, which meant more tax income, and common ideals, which allowed the North to pass almost any bill they wanted, as there was no Southern opposition. In 1861, the Republican Party, Lincoln's party, which then held a strong majority in Congress, created the Morial Tariff Act, raising tariffs by 5 to 10%, and protected the heart of America's industry. With the help of J. Crook and Company, the government sold Liberty Bonds, which essentially allowed the government to borrow money from its citizens, which would later be paid back at a higher price. In 1862 were the Homestead and Pacific Railroad Acts, each serving to create demand for land in the West. The Homestead Act of 1862 provided cheap land, and the Pacific Railroad Act funded the construction of a brand new transcontinental railroad. Not all was good for the North, however. Diplomatic crises brewed throughout the duration of the war, mainly with the United Kingdom. In 1861, one example was the Trent Affair, where a Union ship stopped the British Trent near northern Cuba. The Union forcibly removed Confederate diplomats, and this resulted in outrage across the Atlantic. Both the Union and the British began to prepare for war, characterized by British troop landing in Canada. London demanded an apology and the release of the diplomats. Lincoln decided to slow communications until tensions cooled, where he eventually released them. Events such as these demonstrate the crucial role of diplomacy, not only during times of peace, but especially during times of war. Another instance of Union diplomacy occurred with the British building of Laird rams and commerce raiders, ships that would later join the Confederate fleet. British manufacturers were able to do this under a loophole where they simply did not attach the guns to those ships until they left British waters. The Union minister, Charles Francis Adams, was able to convince London that this set a dangerous precedent, one which could later be used against them. He threatened war, but the British backed off, paying $15 million in 1872 as condolences. Tons of men were needed by both sides to fight. At first, the Northern Army only employed volunteers, with a quota for each state. Then, in 1863, this drive for volunteers slowed. For the first time, Congress enacted a conscription. Many saw this as unfair to the poor, as rich boys, like John D. Rockefeller, could get out by hiring a replacement, or even by paying $300. People likened the government to asking for $300 or your life. In 1863, this brought about the New York draft riots, which were exceptionally violent. The protesters chanted the phrase, "Rich man's war, but a poor man's fight." In the end, the Civil War was one of, if not the most horrific war in American history. Seeing brother versus brother was a sad sight for all. With the help from small towns like Stowe, the North was able to secure victory, preserve the Union, and go on a campaign for civil rights. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution each further progressed this by guaranteeing the abolition of slavery, citizenship to everyone born in America, and the elimination of racial barriers to voting, respectively. While this was a major success in the movement for civil rights, there was still much to be done. Jim Crow laws would begin to rise up in the South as the Reconstruction era ended, and they would remain until a century later, when Congress enacted the Civil Rights Acts during the 1960s. Additionally, women were forced to wait over 50 years before the barrier of sex was removed from voting restrictions. Overall, the Civil War was a massive defeat for conservative Southerners, but a major victory for Unionist and reformist Northerners.